My son was ashamed of the house I spent 30 years building my life in, and he didn't bother hiding it. The first time he brought Melissa home to meet me, she walked through my front door, looked at the floral wallpaper in my entryway, the one my husband Theodore had hung himself the summer before he got sick, and she said, "Oh, it's very cozy." She smiled when she said it, the kind of smile that means something else entirely. I told myself I was imagining things. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 64 years old. I live alone in a 4-bedroom house in Davenport, Iowa, and I raised my son Caleb to be a good man. Or at least I thought I had. Caleb was my only child. Theodore and I had tried for others, but it didn't happen, and after a while we stopped trying and just loved what God gave us. Caleb was bright and funny, and he had his father's eyes, this particular shade of gray-green that changed depending on what he was wearing. I used to stare at those eyes when he was a baby and think, I made this. This person came from me. There is no feeling in the world like that one. Theodore passed when Caleb was 26. Heart attack, sudden, on a Tuesday morning in March. He had been making eggs. The pan was still on the stove when the paramedics came. I kept thinking about those eggs for weeks afterward. I don't know why. Grief is strange that way. It attaches itself to the smallest things. After Theodore died, Caleb called me every Sunday, without fail. He lived in Chicago by then, working at a consulting firm, wearing suits that cost more than my first car. I was proud of him. I want to be clear about that. I was proud of everything he had made of himself. I just didn't know yet what it was costing us. He met Melissa 2 years after his father died. She was a colleague of his, corporate attorney, sharp as a tack, beautiful in that polished magazine cover way. I liked her, at first. She was confident and she made Caleb laugh, and that was enough for me in the beginning. The wedding was in Napa, 212 guests. My sister Evelyn stood next to me in a pale blue dress and whispered, "How much do you think this cost?" And I squeezed her hand and said, "Don't." Because I didn't want to think about the fact that Theodore wasn't there, that he never got to see his son get married. For the first year of their marriage, things were fine. Caleb and Melissa came home for Christmas and Thanksgiving, and things felt mostly normal. Melissa would sometimes wrinkle her nose at the green bean casserole I made from scratch every year, Theodore's recipe, not the canned soup kind, and say something about sodium content or processed ingredients. I let it go. She was young. She had opinions. Fine. But then something shifted. I'm not sure when exactly. It was gradual, the way these things always are. One comment became two became a pattern. The pattern became so familiar I almost stopped noticing it. "Mom, is this carpet original to the house?" Melissa asked once, looking down at the living room floor. "It is," I said. "We put it in 1998. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're trying to be diplomatic. "Have you ever thought about hardwood?" I had not thought about hardwood. I liked my carpet. Theodore and I had picked it out together from a catalog, sitting at the kitchen table with cups of coffee, arguing cheerfully about whether to go with the burgundy or the sage. We went with the burgundy. I have never once regretted it. I didn't say any of that. I just said, "The carpet's in good shape." Caleb said nothing. That was the other thing I started to notice. Caleb said nothing. He had always been a man who spoke his mind. As a teenager, that quality had driven me half crazy. But now he just sat there, quiet, while his wife reshaped the room with her words. I told myself he was tired. I told myself he was deferring to her because that was what you did in a marriage. I told myself a lot of things. The summer Caleb and Melissa had been married 3 years. They came to Davenport for the 4th of July. I cooked for 2 days. Pot roast, potato salad, Theodore's mother's banana pudding, homemade biscuits. The kind of cooking that takes time because it's supposed to. Because the time is the point. My neighbor Frances Delacroix came over with her husband, and my friend Carol's daughter, though wait, I should not use that name. A woman from my church came over, a good friend of mine, and brought her husband. We sat on the back porch with iced tea and watched the neighbor's kids chase fireflies, and it was the kind of evening that makes you remember what summer is supposed to feel like. And then Melissa said it. She said it quietly, so not everyone heard, but I heard. She was standing in my kitchen with Caleb while I was slicing the banana pudding, and she said, "I don't know how she eats like this at her age. My cardiologist would lose his mind." She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to my son. And my son said, "And I will never forget this as long as I live." My son said, "I know, I've told her." I set down the knife. I stood there for a moment with my hand on my kitchen counter. The one Theodore and I had resurfaced ourselves the summer before he got sick, and I breathed in through my nose. I did not turn around. I did not say a word. I served the banana pudding. The evening ended pleasantly enough on the surface. People laughed and the fireworks were beautiful, and I hugged Caleb goodbye at the door this next morning, and I smiled and said, "Drive safe." And then I closed the door, and I sat down on the bottom step of my staircase, and I stayed there for a long time. I had been telling myself for 3 years that Melissa meant well, that she was just particular about food and health and aesthetics, that it was generational. Young people now were different about these things. I had been making excuses so automatically, I had started to believe them. But sitting on that step, I couldn't make excuses for my son. He had been in that kitchen with me his entire childhood. He knew what every dish meant. He knew that the banana pudding was his grandmother's recipe, that I made it from real vanilla wafers and real whipped cream, and that I had been making it since before he was born. He knew that cooking was the language my family spoke for love, and he had stood in my kitchen and agreed with his wife that it was a problem. I did not sleep well that night. In September of that year, Caleb called on a Sunday as usual, and near the end of the call he mentioned, very casually, the way you mentioned something you've been rehearsing, that he and Melissa were thinking about the holidays. "We were actually considering doing Christmas in Chicago this year," he said. "Melissa's parents are getting older, and it would be easier for them." "Of course," I said. "And maybe Thanksgiving too, just this once." I said of course again. My voice was perfectly steady. After we hung up, I went to my kitchen, and I made myself a cup of tea and I sat at the table for a while. The kitchen was quiet. The house was very quiet in general, the way it had been since Theodore died, but that evening the quiet felt different, pointed. I thought about the last 8 Thanksgivings, every single one spent in this house. Caleb eating thirds of the sweet potato casserole, Theodore carving the turkey with that ridiculous electric knife. He insisted on using every year even though it scared the cat. The way we'd always end the night watching old football games and arguing about nothing in particular. I thought about how I had rearranged that memory to make room for Melissa, and how it had never quite fit right since then. I did not call Caleb back. I did not make a scene. I simply decided something, sitting there at my kitchen table with my tea going cold. I would stop waiting. I spent that Thanksgiving with my sister Evelyn in Columbus. We cooked together in her small apartment kitchen, bumping elbows and laughing, and I made Theodore's mother's sweet potato casserole. And Evelyn made the kind of cornbread dressing that comes from a box, because she has never been a cook, and doesn't pretend otherwise. It was one of the best Thanksgivings I'd had in years. I am not ashamed to say that. I spent Christmas quietly. I went to midnight service at my church, and I came home and made myself a proper Christmas breakfast, biscuits and gravy and a single mimosa, and I called Evelyn and a few friends. I did not sit by the phone waiting for Caleb's call the way I had the year before. That year I had answered on the first ring. This year I let it go to voicemail. He left a message. "Hey Mom, Merry Christmas. Hope you're having a good day. Talk soon." 22 seconds. I listened to it once, and then I set the phone down and went to finish my biscuits. Talk soon. The change in me was not angry. I want to be clear about that because I think people sometimes confuse setting limits with punishing someone, and those are not the same thing at all. I was not punishing Caleb. I was simply done arranging my life around someone who had made it clear, not with cruelty, but with casual, careless consistency, that my life was not something he valued. I stopped initiating. I stopped calling first. I stopped planning around his schedule. Stopped putting off dental appointments or visits with friends on the chance that he might want to come home. I stopped holding my breath. And I started living in my own house like it was mine again. I repainted the guest room. I'd been wanting to do it for years but had always kept it the neutral beige Melissa had once called the safer choice for guests. I painted it a deep, warm coral. Theodore would have hated it and would have teased me about it for years, and that made me love it more. I took down the throw pillows. Melissa had brought me one Christmas, the ones in the updated color palette she said would modernize the space. I put back the quilt my mother had made. My friend Frances Delacroix came over one afternoon and walked into the guest room and said, "Oh, I love that color," and I felt something loosen in my chest. I started hosting again. Dinners for friends from church, Sunday afternoons with Evelyn when she visited, a standing weekly breakfast with a woman named Harriet from my book club. No, wait, I cannot use that name either. A woman from my book club, a dear friend, who always brought the good orange juice. These were not consolation gatherings. They were just my life, lived at full volume, in my own home, on my own terms. Caleb called sporadically. Once in February, twice in March. Always catching up, always pleasant on the surface, never quite landing on anything real. I was warm with him. He was my son and I loved him. Those two things had not changed, but I had stopped performing closeness we didn't have. I did not invite him to Easter. He noticed that. He called on the Monday after Easter and said, "Did you do anything for the holiday?" And when I told him I'd had a small dinner at the house, there was a pause. "Oh," he said, "I didn't know you were doing that." "You didn't ask," I said. Gently, honestly, another pause. "Mom, is everything okay?" I thought about that question. I had been asked it my whole life in moments of deflection. When what the person really meant was, "Are you going to make this difficult? Or are you going to pretend everything is fine?" And for most of my life I had chosen pretending. "I'm doing very well, actually," I said. "How are you?" It was June when things started to crack open. Caleb called on a Thursday evening, which was unusual. His voice was different, tighter somehow, stripped of the easy professional confidence that had become his default. "Melissa and I are having some problems," he said. I did not say I'm sorry. I said, "Tell me what's going on." He talked for 40 minutes. I won't share all of it because some of it was private, and even now, even knowing what I know, I believe his marriage is his business. What I will say is that the problems were real, and they were serious, and they had apparently been building for longer than he'd let on. He sounded young on the phone in a way he hadn't in years. He sounded like the boy who used to come into the kitchen while I was cooking and sit on the counter and just talk, not because anything was wrong, but because being near me was comfortable. "I think I've been pretty checked out," he said at one point. "From a lot of things." I held the phone and I looked at the coral guest room through the open doorway, and I chose my words carefully. "I think that's probably true," I said. There was a silence that might have been hurt, but I think was actually relief. "Can I come home for a few days?" he asked. I did not leap. I did not say, of course, yes, right away, however long you need. I'll make up the room, I'll cook everything you love, I'll be so grateful to have you. I had done that version of myself for years and it had not served either of us. "Yes," I said, "come the week after next. I'll be here." He came on a Wednesday. He drove himself, alone, and I heard his car in the driveway, and I finished what I was doing in the kitchen before I went to the door. I did not stand at the window watching for him. Those days were behind me. When I opened the door, he looked tired. Not sick, just worn through, the way men look when they've been performing steadiness for too long. He hugged me in the doorway, and I held him for a moment. My son, who was now 41 years old, and taller than his father had been, and still, underneath all of it, the boy I had raised in this house. "Something smells incredible," he said into my shoulder. "Pot roast," I said. "Get your bag." We ate at the kitchen table, just the two of us, and there was no talk of sodium content or carbohydrates or what my cardiologist might think. He had 2 helpings and then pushed back from the table and said, "I forgot what real food tasted like." I didn't respond to that directly. I got up and started clearing dishes. "Mom," he said, "can I ask you something?" I ran water over the plates. "Did I hurt your feelings over these last few years? Was I?" He paused. Was I not paying attention to things I should have been paying attention to? I turned off the water. I turned around and I looked at my son, and I thought about all the moments that had accumulated over the years. Melissa and her cardiologist. The Christmas calls that lasted 22 seconds. The way he had learned to be silent in rooms where he should have spoken. I thought about the banner pudding I had served without saying a word. I thought about the quiet dignity of choosing yourself, finally, after 60 years of choosing everyone else first. "Yes," I said. "You did." He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they've known the answer for a while. and have finally gotten around to asking the question. "I'm sorry," he said. "I really am, Mom." I dried my hands on a dish towel, the embroidered one from Evelyn, the one that said "Home is where the biscuits are," and I hung it back on the oven handle. "I know you are," I said. "Apologies are a start. But they're just a start." He stayed for 5 days. On the second day, he asked if he could help me with anything, and I handed him a paintbrush and we retouched the back porch together, the way he and Theodore used to do every few summers. He was quiet while we worked, the kind of quiet that was comfortable, not absent. He asked about Evelyn. He asked about Francis from next door. He asked about my book club. Who was in it? What we'd been reading. Whether I was still doing the summer reading challenge at the library where I volunteered Tuesday afternoons. He asked about things he should have been asking about for years. On the third evening, we sat on that back porch after dinner with glasses of sweet tea and watched the light go pink over the neighbor's oak trees, and he said, "This house is actually really beautiful. I don't know when I stopped seeing that." I sipped my tea. "Melissa used to say it needed updating," he said, not quite looking at me. And I just went along with it. I don't even know why. Because it was easier, maybe. Because I was trying to be in 2 places at once and I kept choosing wrong. "You did choose wrong," I said. "More than once, I know, but you're here now." I paused. "That matters. Not as much as the years in between, but it matters." He was quiet for a long time after that. A firefly appeared at the edge of the yard, then another. The oak trees went from pink to gray. "Melissa and I are probably going to separate," he said finally. "I don't know yet. Nothing's decided." "That's between you and her," I said. "Not between you and me." He looked over at me then. "I want us to be better," he said. "You and me. I want to call you every Sunday again. For real. Not just going through the motions. I want to come home." I looked at my son, the gray-green eyes, his father's eyes, and I felt the whole long weight of the last several years settle and shift. "Then do that," I said simply. "Not you're forgiven. Not all is forgotten. Not my door is always open. Come anytime. I'll be waiting." Those were things the woman I used to be would have said, eager to smooth it over, to put things back the way they were as fast as possible. But you cannot go back to the way things were. You can only decide what you're going to build with what's left. "I need you to see me," I told him. "Not just call. Not just show up when things fall apart. I need you to see my life here. My friends, my house, the things I've made for myself. I need you to understand that this is a full life and that you've been missing from it." He looked like he might say something, then didn't. "And I need you to understand that if things go back to the way they were," I continued, "I will not perform being fine. I'm past that." He nodded. Slow and real. "Okay," he said. "I understand." The fireflies multiplied. Somewhere a few streets over, someone was playing music through an open window. Something old, something I half recognized. "There's banana pudding in the refrigerator," I said, standing up. "If you want some before bed." He smiled at that, a real smile, the one that went all the way to his eyes. "Yes, please," he said, like he was 8 years old again. That was nearly 2 years ago now. Caleb calls every Sunday. He comes home 3 or 4 times a year. He and Melissa did separate, and that was its own grief, separate from ours, and I held space for it without making it about me. He has been in therapy, which I am glad for. He has been asking better questions of himself. Last Thanksgiving, he sat at my kitchen table and watched me cook for the first time in years. Really watched, the way he used to, as a child, asking what went into this, why I seasoned it that way. How long had I been making this particular dish? I gave him the recipe for the sweet potato casserole, handwritten on an index card, because it occurred to me that I hadn't done that yet. "Grandma Iris's recipe?" he asked, reading the card. "Her recipe and mine now," I said. "Someday it'll be yours." He folded the card very carefully and put it in his wallet. I pretended not to notice. My house is still burgundy carpet and coral guest room and Theodore's wallpaper in the entryway. My kitchen smells like things that take time. My life is full in ways I had started to forget were possible. Full of Tuesday mornings at the library, and Francis Delacroix's laugh, and Evelyn's terrible cornbread dressing, and a book club that has somehow become one of the great anchors of my late life. I do not need my son to approve of any of it. I never did. But I am glad, I am genuinely deeply glad, that he has found his way back to seeing it. Some people learn through words. Some people learn through consequences. My son learned through absence, through the particular silence of a mother who stopped making herself smaller to make other people comfortable. I am 64 years old. I live in a house that holds 30 years of my life in its walls. I raised a good man. I still believe that. And I loved a good man. And I have made something of this ordinary, beautiful life that does not require anyone's approval to stand. That has always been true. I just had to remember it.